Picture a world without satellites, without digital maps, without highways connecting continents in a seamless web. A world where the lines of power were not drawn on paper, but carved into the earth itself by the relentless movement of feet, hooves, and hulls. This was the medieval era, a time we often imagine as dark, isolated, and stagnant. But nothing could be further from the truth. It was an age of astonishing connectivity, where the very paths people traveled became the instruments through which empires rose, economies flourished, and cultures collided. In an era defined by distance and danger, the ability to move and to control that movement was the ultimate source of authority. Those who mastered the roads, the rivers, and the seas didn't just move goods. They projected influence, enforced loyalty, and built legacies that would endure for centuries. Think about it. What is power if not the ability to make your presence felt where you aren't physically present? For medieval rulers, merchants, and visionaries, transport systems were the answer. These networks were far more than practical solutions for getting from one place to another. They were living, breathing maps of ambition, each route a declaration of intent, each toll station a statement of control, each harbor a gateway to empire. From the snow-capped Alpine passes that decided the fate of kingdoms to the sprawling Silk Road caravans that carried not only silk and spice but ideas and innovations, these pathways wove together the fabric of the medieval world. They decided who grew rich and who remained poor, which cities thrived and which faded into obscurity, which wars were won and which cultures would endure. In this video, we're setting out on a journey to explore 25 of the most brilliant and consequential transport systems of the medieval age. We'll traverse the Roman roads that outlasted the empire itself, sail with the merchant fleets of the Hanseatic League, and ride alongside Mongol messengers who moved intelligence across continents at breathtaking speed. You'll see how something as simple as a bridge or a mountain path could become a geopolitical weapon, and how control over something as humble as salt or wool could bankroll dynasties and topple kings. This isn't just a story about how people moved, it's a story about how movement shaped our world, laying the groundwork for the global networks we navigate today. So prepare to see history in motion and to understand, perhaps for the first time, how the routes of the past still guide the flow of power in the present. But the collapse of Rome didn't mean these roads simply vanished into the earth. Far from it. They became perhaps the most coveted inheritance of the post-Roman world, a ready-made skeleton of power that emerging kingdoms scrambled to control. Imagine a Frankish king like Charlemagne looking to unite a vast and fractured territory. He didn't need to invent a system of control. He found one already laid out before him, etched into the landscape in stone and gravel. These roads gave him the unparalleled ability to move his armies with a speed his fragmented enemies could never match. A rebellion in one province could be met with a professional force within weeks, not months, because the legion's pathways were still there, clear and direct. This wasn't just about military logistics, though. These ancient highways became the essential arteries for the medieval economy. Royal tax collectors traveled these known routes to gather dues from far-flung manors, and merchants carrying goods between emerging towns relied on their durability. Control the road, and you control the flow of wealth. This repurposing of Roman infrastructure is perfectly exemplified by the Via Regia, the King's Road. This wasn't a single road but a network of routes stretching across Europe, from the Rhine deep into eastern territories. Its very name announces its function. This was a pathway under royal protection and, more importantly, royal authority. Kings didn't just use this road, they actively maintained it because they understood it was a direct line to their power. They granted safe conduct to merchants who used it, but that safety came at a price, a toll, a tax, a tangible cut of the commerce that flowed along their domain. Fortresses and watchtowers were built along its length, not just for defense but to monitor movement and enforce the king's law. The road itself became a mobile border, a long, thin extension of the royal will. To travel the Via Regia was to be constantly reminded of the crown's presence, a physical manifestation of the king's reach that stretched far beyond the sight of his castle walls. Beyond their practical use, these Roman roads carried immense symbolic weight. For the common person living in a world of local lords and limited horizons, these impossibly straight, enduring stone pathways were a daily reminder of a greater, more organized power. They were artifacts of a lost giant, and the medieval rulers who commanded them were consciously stepping into those giant shoes. By repairing a Roman bridge or stationing troops at a Roman crossroads, a king was performing continuity. He was sending a message that his authority was not new or fragile, but was the natural successor to the legendary order of Rome itself. The road was a symbol of permanence in a changing world, and controlling it was a way to borrow that permanence for one's own dynasty. So while the empire that built them was long gone, the vision of centralized control they represented never died. It was merely repaved stone by stone, by the medieval rulers who understood that the path to power is quite literally a road. Yet while kings and emperors built their power on the solid, unmoving stone of old Roman roads, an entirely different kind of empire was rising in the north, one built not on land but on water. This was the domain of the Hanseatic League, a sprawling confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities that turned the Baltic and North Seas into its own private highway of influence. Without a single emperor or a standing army, the Hansa mastered a new form of power, one that flowed with the tides and the trade winds. Their authority wasn't carved in stone or enforced by knights. It was carried in the holds of countless cog ships, vessels that became the lifeblood of a commercial network so vast and effective that it could dictate terms to kings and reshape the destiny of nations. At its heart, the League's power was a simple, brilliant equation. Control the choke points and you control the commerce. Cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges weren't just dots on a map, they were strategic linchpins. Lübeck, often called the Queen of the Hansa, sat at the narrow base of the Jutland Peninsula, making it the perfect gateway between the Baltic and the North Sea. Any merchant wanting to move goods from the rich herring grounds of Scandinavia to the wealthy markets of Flanders and England had to pass through this corridor, and the Hanseatic merchants made sure they paid for the privilege. In Bruges, the League secured special privileges and its own trading compound, effectively controlling access to one of medieval Europe's most important commercial hubs. By commanding these nodal points, the Hansa didn't need to conquer territory. They just needed to control the flow of goods through it. Their network was a monopoly in motion, and they defended it with ruthless efficiency. This economic dominance gave them a political weapon far more potent than any sword, the trade boycott. When a foreign ruler dared to threaten Hanseatic privileges or arrest their merchants, the response was not a declaration of war, but a collective and chilling silence. Ports would be closed to that city or kingdom. The vital flow of salt, grain, timber, and wool would simply stop. One of the most famous examples came in 1370, when the League blockaded the entire region of Flanders for over 5 years after local authorities seized Hanseatic goods. The economic pressure was immense and ultimately irresistible. The Flemish cities capitulated completely, restoring the League's privileges and paying hefty reparations. This was soft power in its most raw and effective medieval form. They could sway wars by choosing which side to supply, fund allies with generous loans, and even negotiate treaties in their own right, acting as a sovereign state in all but name. The physical symbol of this power was the Hanseatic cog, a sturdy, capacious ship that was the workhorse of the Baltic. These ships did more than carry barrels of salted herring and bundles of fur. They were floating pieces of sovereign territory. They carried the legal codes of their home cities, the authority of their merchant councils, and the collective might of the entire League. A Hanseatic ship docking in London or Novgorod was not just a visitor, it was an outpost, a mobile extension of a vast, decentralized empire. The sea, which for others was a dangerous barrier, was for the Hansa a connective tissue, a space they alone could navigate with confidence and security. They turned the Baltic into their own private chessboard, moving goods and enforcing their will across a grid of sea lanes that they alone truly mastered. In doing so, they provided a blueprint for every future maritime empire, proving that the most enduring maps of power are not always drawn on land, but are charted in the deep, ever-shifting currents of commerce and the sea. While the Hanseatic League mastered the seas of northern Europe, an even more legendary network of power was weaving together the vast continents of Asia and Europe, the Silk Road. It's a name that conjures images of ancient camel caravans and the distant Han dynasty, but its true zenith of influence came in the medieval era. Far from being a single road, it was a sprawling, ever-shifting web of overland trails that became the world's first great information superhighway. In an age without instant communication, the Silk Road did more than transport silks and spices. It moved religions, technologies, languages, and even plagues, making it the ultimate medieval instrument for projecting soft power and imperial ambition across staggering distances. Control over this flow was the ultimate prize. For the Mongol Empire, under rulers like Genghis and Kublai Khan, the Silk Road was the central nervous system of their dominion. They didn't just conquer territory, they secured the routes that ran through it. The famous Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, wasn't merely an absence of war, it was a deliberate policy of safe passage. The Mongols suppressed bandits, built and fortified caravanserais, and standardized trade regulations across their empire. Why? Because a secure Silk Road meant a wealthy, stable empire. Taxes from the lucrative trade filled their coffers, but the intelligence that traveled with the merchants was even more valuable. A Mongol ruler in Karakoram could learn about a rebellion in Persia or a power shift in China from the gossip of traders long before any official messenger could arrive. The road itself became a tool of surveillance and control, making the vastness of their empire manageable. The real power centers along these routes were the caravanserais. We might picture them as simple desert motels, but they were so much more. These fortified way stations, often a day's journey apart, were the beating hearts of the Silk Road. Within their walls, a Persian merchant could barter with a Chinese official. A Nestorian Christian missionary could debate theology with a Buddhist monk, and a Mongol spy could listen to it all. They were chaotic, vibrant hubs of cross-cultural exchange where ideas were traded as actively as goods. A new design for a water wheel, a revolutionary astronomical concept from Samarkand, or a heretical religious text could all find their way into a trader's pack and from there change the world. Controlling a major caravanserai was like controlling a major internet hub today. You influenced the flow of everything that passed through it. This control over the arteries of exchange allowed empires to project their influence far beyond their military reach. The Byzantine Empire, strategically perched at the western terminus of the Silk Road in Constantinople, grew immensely wealthy by taxing the goods flowing into Europe. But they also skillfully manipulated this access, using luxury items like Chinese silk as diplomatic gifts to awe and influence European neighbors. Later, as European powers began to look eastward, their desire wasn't just for goods but for alliances. They sent emissaries like Marco Polo down these very routes, hoping to forge partnerships with Mongol Khans against common enemies. These journeys were equal parts diplomacy, espionage, and exploration, all made possible by the existing infrastructure of the Silk Road. Perhaps the most profound and unintended demonstration of the Silk Road's power was biological. In the 1340s, the same routes that carried gold and ideas also carried the Black Death. Fleas on rats hiding in bales of cloth brought the plague from the steppes of Central Asia to the ports of the Black Sea, and from there to the rest of Europe. This catastrophic event reshaped the continent's demographics, economy, and social structure forever. It was the ultimate, grim lesson that in an interconnected world, even the most magnificent displays of power, be they Mongol empires or thriving commercial cities, were vulnerable to what traveled along the routes they worked so hard to control. The Silk Road was a map of human ambition, but it also revealed our profound interconnectedness, for good and for ill. But while empires moved armies and merchants moved goods, a different kind of power was being quietly woven across the European landscape, one that relied not on force or finance, but on faith and information. In an age where news traveled at the speed of a walking man, one institution mastered the art of rapid, reliable communication: the medieval church. Through orders like the Cistercians and Benedictines, a sprawling network of monasteries became the nodes in a continent-wide information exchange, operating a sophisticated courier system that turned the church into a pre-modern superpower. This was not a network of roads or sea lanes, but a web of trust and devotion, enabling the Vatican to project its will with a speed and consistency that kings could only envy. The physical infrastructure of this system was the monastery itself. Thousands of these religious houses, from remote Irish cliffs to the heart of the German forests, were bound together by a common rule and a common loyalty to Rome. A message leaving the Pope's desk could be carried by a series of dedicated monastic riders, each knowing they could find safe shelter, fresh horses, and trusted colleagues at the next abbey along the route. This was a system built on unparalleled institutional stability. A king's messenger might find a castle in rebellion or a road held by bandits, but a monastic courier could almost always rely on the next monastery being exactly where it was supposed to be, operating under the same authority for centuries. This reliability made their messaging service faster and more secure than any royal postal system of the time. The content of these messages was where the real power lay. This network was the circulatory system for the lifeblood of the Church's authority. Papal bulls' decrees with the force of law for all of Christendom were disseminated through these channels, shaping theology and condemning heresy from the top down. Financial instructions flowed just as freely. Orders to collect tithes, transfer funds between monastic houses, and manage the vast earthly wealth of the Church ensured its economic engine never stalled. But perhaps most strikingly, this communication web was a powerful political tool. The Church was the ultimate insider in medieval power politics. News of a king's death, a noble's rebellion, or a queen's pregnancy would often reach the papal court via monastic channels long before it was widely known. This intelligence allowed popes and cardinals to act with decisive advantage, sending letters of support to allies or threats of excommunication to rivals, influencing royal successions and tipping the scales of war. To protect these sensitive messages, monastic orders often employed early forms of encryption and cipher. A letter might appear to be a simple devotional text, but to a trained eye, certain patterns of letters or coded phrases concealed its true meaning. This ensured that news of a planned papal intervention or a secret donation from a noble patron remained confidential. The combination of speed, security, and reach made the medieval church arguably the world's first information empire. Long before the telegraph or the internet, they understood a fundamental truth. He who controls the flow of information controls the narrative, and he who controls the narrative controls the world. Their couriers, riding on muddy tracks between stone abbeys, were the packets of data that sustained this vast spiritual network, proving that the most powerful maps are not always of land, but of knowledge and influence. Yet for all the power of information networks and maritime empires, some of the most decisive control over medieval Europe was exerted not across open water, but through the continent's most formidable natural barriers, the soaring, ice-carved peaks of the Alps. These mountains, which seem to carve a great divide between the Mediterranean world and the northern plains, were in fact not a barrier at all, but a filter. And controlling the filter meant controlling the destiny of nations. Passes like the Brenner and the St. Gothard were the precious few gateways where armies could march, goods could flow, and ideas could cross. They were the ultimate geographical choke points, and the states that mastered them didn't just facilitate travel, they weaponized geography itself. Consider the sheer economics of it. A merchant caravan traveling from the markets of Venice to the fairs of Champagne faced a daunting journey. The Alps stood in their way like a wall, but at certain points the mountains relented, offering narrow, treacherous paths that could be navigated. The Republic of Venice understood this better than anyone. They didn't just use the Brenner Pass, they actively worked to make it the preferred route, improving the road, building rest houses, and ensuring a measure of safety for travelers. Why such generosity? Because every merchant who chose the Brenner was funneled into a controlled environment. At the narrowest point of the pass, the Venetians or their allied lords would erect a toll station. Here, every bale of silk, every barrel of wine, every pound of pepper was assessed a duty. The pass became a fiscal valve, and Venice held its hand firmly on the wheel, siphoning a steady stream of wealth from the commerce between north and south. This wasn't merely taxation, it was a brilliantly executed monopoly on mobility, but the value of these passes went far beyond filling coffers. They were also instruments of high-stakes geopolitical strategy. The Holy Roman Emperor, whose domain stretched from the North Sea down to the Alpine foothills, viewed control of these passes as a matter of national security. A well-placed fortress like the one at Kufstein guarding the approach to the Brenner could serve as an impassable gate. By granting or denying passage, the emperor could decide the fate of wars. He could allow his own troops to descend into Italy to assert his authority, or he could block the advance of a rival army, stranding them in the frozen heights. During times of conflict, a single order from a distant capital could slam these gates shut, effectively enacting an economic blockade that could cripple a rival city-state by severing its lifeline to northern markets. The Alps, in this sense, were transformed from a passive wall into an active extension of imperial will. The story of the St. Gothard Pass further illustrates this transformative power. Before the construction of a daring bridge across the Schierlingen Gorge in the early 13th century, this route was virtually impassable. Its opening was a feat of medieval engineering that suddenly created a more direct route from Germany to Italy. The cantons of Uri and Schwyz, which controlled the northern approach, found their fortunes instantly transformed from poor mountain communities to the guardians of a vital international corridor. The power and wealth they gained from protecting and taxing this traffic became the very foundation of the Swiss Confederacy. It was control over a path, not ownership of vast lands, that granted them the leverage to eventually defy both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Duke of Habsburg. Their ambition was amplified by the mountain pass they commanded. Ultimately, the history of these Alpine passes teaches us that in the medieval world, the most valuable territory was often not the expansive plain, but the constricted corridor. A king might rule thousands of square miles, but if another power held the mountain pass that connected his realm to the rest of the world, his authority was conditional. The forts that crowned these heights were more than just military installations. They were physical manifestations of a profound truth, that in a world defined by movement, the power to allow or deny passage is the power to shape destiny. The Alps did not divide Europe. They provided the narrow, controlled stages upon which its greatest power struggles were performed. If the Alpine passes were the fortified gates of medieval Europe, then its great rivers were the open, flowing boulevards, but even these waterways were far from free. Picture the Rhine or the Danube not as natural features, but as the most lucrative commercial real estate imaginable, every twist and turn a potential opportunity for wealth extraction. For the local lord whose castle overlooked a sharp bend in the river, this geographical accident was a gift from God. He could, with a modest investment in a chain, a tower, and a few armed men, establish a toll station that would function as a perpetual revenue machine. The river did the work of guiding the traffic directly to his door, and his authority did the rest, forcing every passing merchant to contribute to his treasury. This was a system of power that was both brilliantly simple and ruthlessly effective, transforming the very currents of the river into a source of coercive control. The strategic placement of these toll stations was a dark art in itself. They were never positioned at random. The ideal location was a point where the river narrowed, where the current was too strong to easily turn a boat around, or just after a difficult stretch of rapids where weary boatmen would be less inclined to put up a fight. The most infamous spots were at the territories of ambitious prince-bishops, high-ranking churchmen who wielded both spiritual and temporal power. The Archbishop of Mainz, for example, held a constellation of toll castles along the Rhine, allowing him to tax the same traffic multiple times on its journey. A merchant sailing from Basel to Cologne might have to pass a dozen such stations, each with its own arbitrary fee. The justification for these tolls was often thin at best, a claim of providing protection from river pirates, many of whom were likely in the pay of the toll lord himself. It was protection racketeering on a continental scale, sanctioned by custom and enforced by the spear. The financial impact of this system was staggering. The revenue generated from these river tolls didn't just line the pockets of local nobles. It funded the very architecture of power we associate with the medieval era. The magnificent castle of Marksburg, perched high above the Rhine, was largely paid for by the coins extracted from the boats below. The soaring cathedrals that dominated riverfront cities like Cologne or Regensburg were built not just on faith, but on the steady flow of commerce that their ecclesiastical lords expertly taxed. Most significantly, this river gold-financed war. A prince could fund a military campaign by promising his knights a share of the increased toll revenues from a conquered stretch of riverbank. The ability to move troops and supplies along the river was crucial, but the ability to pay for those troops by taxing the river was even more so. Control of a river thus became a self-financing loop. Power brought revenue, and revenue bought more power. For the merchants who had to navigate this gauntlet of greed, the river toll system was a constant and frustrating burden. They developed intricate ledgers accounting for the expected fees at each castle, and the price of their goods reflected this accumulated cost. Some tried to bribe toll collectors, others sailed at night or in bad weather to avoid detection, and the wealthiest might secure a special privilege from a king or emperor, a letter of passage that granted them exemption. But these were exceptions. For most, the endless tolls were simply a tax on doing business. a cost that was ultimately passed down to every consumer in the form of higher prices for salt, wine, cloth, and other essentials. The river, which should have been a great unifier and a cheap conduit for trade, was instead carved up into countless little domains of petty tyranny, each with its hand out. This fragmentation of power on the waterways stands in stark contrast to the Hanseatic League's control of the sea lanes, revealing a central tension of the medieval world: the struggle between local extraction and long-distance trade, between the parochial lord in his riverside castle and the ambitious merchant looking to connect distant markets. Yet for all the coercive power of river tolls and the calculated control of mountain passes, medieval Europe also witnessed the rise of a transport system that derived its immense influence from an entirely different source: voluntary devotion. The pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, collectively known as the Way of St. James, created a map of power drawn not by the sword, but by the footsteps of millions of faithful travelers. To see these paths merely as spiritual highways is to miss their profound earthly impact. They functioned as massive economic engines, sophisticated tools of political propaganda, and instruments of cultural unification, all flowing from the relentless stream of pilgrims seeking redemption at the shrine of the Apostle. The economic transformation along these routes was nothing short of revolutionary. Imagine a steady, predictable flow of travelers, not an army to be feared, but a market on the move. They needed food, shelter, clothing, and souvenirs. Entire towns, known as villes étapes, sprang into existence solely to service this traffic. Kings and local nobles, recognizing a golden opportunity, became the venture capitalists of this spiritual journey. They invested heavily in infrastructure, not out of pure charity, but with a keen eye on the returns. Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, for instance, actively promoted the French route, commissioning the construction of sturdy bridges over treacherous rivers, funding hospitals like the one in Santo Domingo de la Calzada, and granting special privileges to merchants who settled in new towns along the path. This wasn't just about facilitating faith, it was about creating a pilgrimage economy. Every new bridge cut days off the journey, funneling more pilgrims and their money through a specific territory. Every hospital, while providing Christian charity, also anchored a local economy of caregivers, cooks, and suppliers. The pilgrim's scallop shell might have been a symbol of faith, but for the communities along the way, it was the sound of coins jingling in the town square. Politically, control over the pilgrimage route became a powerful way for rulers to legitimize their authority and burnish their reputation. In a world where divine right was a cornerstone of power, being seen as the protector of pilgrims was a masterstroke of public relations. A king who built a bridge could be celebrated as a pious benefactor, a direct servant of God's travelers. This generosity was a public performance of virtue, demonstrating a ruler's strength and benevolence to his own subjects and to visiting nobles from across Europe. The routes also became vital channels for diplomacy and alliance building. When a French duke or an English earl traveled to Compostela with a large retinue, their journey through different kingdoms was a state visit in miniature, fostering political connections and cultural exchange. Controlling the pathway meant having a front-row seat to this constant flow of European elite, offering a chance to influence, impress, and negotiate. Perhaps the most subtle and significant power wielded through these routes was the power to standardize belief and suppress dissent. The Church, in partnership with supportive monarchs, effectively guided the religious traffic of Europe down a sanctioned path. By building magnificent cathedrals and monasteries at key points along the way, like the awe-inspiring Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, which controlled several major branches of the route, they could ensure pilgrims were exposed to Orthodox Catholic doctrine and liturgy. The journey itself became a form of indoctrination, a long physical reinforcement of correct faith. This was particularly crucial during times of heresy, such as the spread of Cathar beliefs in southern France. By promoting the Santiago pilgrimage as the premier spiritual adventure, the Church could draw the faithful away from regions of questionable orthodoxy and towards a curated, controlled religious experience. The road to Compostela, in this light, was a bulwark against schism, a way to physically channel the devout away from heresy and towards Rome. The millions of footsteps that wore down the stones to Santiago de Compostela did more than just create a path. They carved a deep groove of economic interdependence, political legitimacy, and religious conformity across the face of medieval Europe, proving that the most powerful journeys are sometimes those we choose to take ourselves. While the pilgrimage routes of Europe thrived on voluntary devotion and the Alpine passes on calculated tolls, the Mongol Empire built its dominance on a principle that seems almost modern in its efficiency: the radical compression of time and space. At its peak, the empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Europe, a territory so vast that a messenger on a fast horse might take a year to cross it. Such a realm should have been ungovernable, fracturing into 100 independent khanates under the sheer weight of its own geography. But the Mongols refused to be constrained by distance. Their solution was the Yam, a courier system of such breathtaking speed and reliability that it effectively shrunk their continental empire to the size of a local province, allowing a single will in Karakorum to be felt instantly on the distant banks of the Volga or the Danube. The genius of the Yam was not in its complexity, but in its elegant, systematic simplicity. Imagine a chain of relay stations called Arteries, spaced roughly every 20 to 30 miles along every major route in the empire. This distance was carefully calculated to be a day's hard ride for a single messenger. At each station, the arriving rider would find fresh, already saddled horses, a meal, and a new rider waiting for the next leg of the journey. The message itself, often an oral communique or a written Pesa tablet that granted the bearer absolute authority, would be handed off without a moment's delay. This meant that the message could travel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at a gallop. The messenger was fresh for every leg, and the horses were always at peak performance. Historical accounts suggest that these couriers could cover up to 200 miles in a single day, a pace that would have been utterly impossible for any single rider and mount. This wasn't just mail delivery. It was a perpetual motion machine for information, a physical internet powered by horseflesh and human endurance. This system granted the great Khan something no ruler before him had ever possessed: real-time oversight of a global empire. A general campaigning in Poland could send a request for instructions and receive a reply from the Mongol capital within a few weeks, not several months. This allowed for a stunning degree of centralized strategic control. Rebellions could be reported and quashed before they had time to spread. Provincial administrators, knowing that a report of their incompetence or corruption could reach the Khan's ears with terrifying speed, were kept in a state of obedient efficiency. Official inspectors and tax collectors could appear suddenly in any corner of the realm, their authority unquestionable thanks to the Pesa they carried. The Yam made the threat of the Khan's wrath immediate and ever-present, no matter how far away one was from the center. Distance, the age-old ally of the rebellious frontier governor, had been decisively neutralized. The Yam's function extended far beyond military orders and bureaucratic oversight. It was the vital circulatory system for the empire's economic and cultural life. The same routes that carried urgent commands also carried sophisticated intelligence reports on crop yields, market prices, and political rumors from subject nations. Persian astronomers could send their observations to colleagues in China. Muslim doctors could receive medicinal texts from Tibetan monasteries. This rapid exchange of knowledge gave the Mongol court a panoramic, almost godlike view of its entire domain, allowing it to manage resources, anticipate famines, and manipulate foreign markets with a precision that stunned their adversaries. The Silk Road thrived under the Pax Mongolica precisely because the Yam provided the security and communication needed for high-value, long-distance commerce. A merchant traveling those routes knew that the same system that moved the Great Khan's armies could also be used to track down and punish bandits who threatened trade. In the end, the true power of the Yam was psychological. For the millions of people living under Mongol rule, the sight of the courier, a blur of dust and pounding hooves, his face set with purpose, his pazer gleaming, was a constant physical reminder of the power that connected their remote village to the will of a single man thousands of miles away. It made the abstract concept of empire tangible and immediate. The system proved that the essence of control is not just the ability to command, but the capacity to know and to be heard. The Mongols understood that an empire is not merely territory on a map. It is a network of communication, and the Yam was the loom on which history's largest contiguous land empire was woven, thread by thread, station by station, into a single formidable whole. While the Mongol Yam system mastered the speed of information across land, a different kind of maritime machine was asserting its dominance in the confined, competitive waters of the Mediterranean. Here, the Republic of Venice crafted an empire not of territory but of trade routes, and its primary instrument was the state-owned merchant galley. This was not merely a ship, it was a floating declaration of power, a perfectly designed tool that allowed a single city-state to punch far above its weight, transforming the entire sea into its own private commercial domain. Venice understood that in a world of rising rivals and fragile alliances, true security came not from vast armies but from controlling the very arteries of commerce. Their galley fleet became the engine of a thalassocracy, a sea-based empire so effective that it turned the Mediterranean into what Venetians simply called our sea. The system's brilliance lay in its fusion of public purpose and private profit. Unlike the Hanseatic League's network of independent merchants, the Venetian galley fleet was owned, financed, and meticulously organized by the state. Each year, the Great Council would auction off the command of these galleys to the city's most prominent noble families, but the terms were strictly controlled. The state dictated the route, the schedule, the cargo capacity, and even the convoy size. This was not free enterprise, it was capitalism directed by a strategic master plan. The most famous of these were the Mude, the great convoy routes. The Muda to Alexandria picked up spices and silks from the east. The Muda to Flanders carried these luxuries north, returning with English wool and Flemish cloth. The Muda to the Black Sea connected to the Silk Road's western terminals. By controlling these scheduled sailings, Venice could guarantee a steady, predictable flow of the world's most valuable goods, stabilizing prices and ensuring that the lion's share of the profit flowed back into the Venetian treasury through taxes and customs duties. But these galleys were more than just cargo vessels. They were among the most formidable warships of their day. Long, sleek, and powered by both oars and sails, they were designed for speed and maneuverability. In their holds, they carried bales of silk and sacks of pepper, but on their decks, they carried companies of crossbowmen and rows of cannon. A Venetian merchant galley was a paradox, a trading ship that no pirate in their right mind would attack, and that few rival navies could challenge without provoking a major war. This dual nature gave Venice immense diplomatic leverage. When a sultan in Egypt or a bey in Tunis considered raising tariffs or seizing Venetian goods, he had to weigh that decision against the knowledge that the same ships that brought him wealth could also bring a squadron of armed galleys to blockade his port. The fleet was a constant, unspoken threat, allowing Venetian diplomats to negotiate from a position of strength that belied their small territorial size. This maritime power allowed Venice to play the role of kingmaker across the Mediterranean. During the Crusades, it was Venetian galleys that provided the critical naval logistics for transporting armies, a service for which they extracted massive payments and territorial concessions, most famously the looting of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. They could choose to bankroll one side in a conflict by offering preferential shipping rates for war material, or they could strangle an enemy by imposing a naval embargo. Their support could make the difference between a throne won and a throne lost. The wealth generated by this system was staggering, and it was poured directly back into the city, building the magnificent palaces, churches, and public works that still define Venice today. The grandeur of St. Mark's Basilica and the Doge's Palace was quite literally funded by pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, all delivered under the protection of the galley fleet. The ultimate lesson of the Venetian system is that supreme power can be projected through logistics rather than land. While other states exhausted their treasuries and manpower in endless wars to conquer and hold provinces, Venice conquered something far more valuable: choke points. They seized and fortified key islands like Crete and Cyprus, not to rule vast populations, but to control naval bases that could protect their sea lanes. Their empire was a network of secure ports and fortified way stations, a constellation of points on a map connected by the reliable, armed passage of their galleys. This allowed them to focus their resources and maintain a resilience that land-based empires, vulnerable to invasion and rebellion, could never match. The Venetian galley fleet stands as a timeless testament to the idea that sometimes the most enduring empires are those that master the spaces between the lands, proving that control over the pathways of commerce can be a far more potent form of dominance than the control of territory itself. While the Venetians mastered the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, the kings of England were discovering a different kind of power, one that grew not on trees or in mines, but on the backs of their own sheep. In the 13th and 14th centuries, England's greatest natural resource was its wool, often called white gold for its incredible value. This wasn't just a commodity, it was a strategic asset. But raw wool is useless without a market, and the finest weavers in Europe were in Flanders and Italy, desperate for the high-quality English fleece. This created a perfect opportunity, not just for profit but for control. The English crown devised a brilliantly simple system to capture all of this value and turn it into a tool of statecraft, the staple. By law, all wool destined for export had to be taken to a designated staple town to be weighed, graded, and most importantly, taxed. This seemingly bureaucratic move transformed scattered trade into a controlled, centralized pipeline, and whoever controlled the pipeline held all the cards. The location of the staple was a geopolitical chess move in itself. Initially, the English crown established the staple not in England, but on the continent, in the Flemish city of Bruges. This made practical sense. It was closer to the customers, but its real purpose was to project English power directly into the heart of Europe. By forcing all English merchants to sell their wool in this one foreign enclave, the king could more easily monitor the trade, ensure the collection of heavy export duties, and use the threat of moving the staple as a diplomatic cudgel. If the Count of Flanders became troublesome or imposed his own taxes, the English king could simply pick up the entire staple and move it to a rival city like Antwerp or Calais. This wasn't just a change of address, it was an economic earthquake. The city that lost the staple would face instant depression, its merchants ruined and its workers unemployed, while the new host city would boom overnight. This gave English diplomats an incredibly powerful bargaining chip, allowing them to manipulate Flemish politics and ensure the region's loyalty, all without drawing a single sword. The financial impact of this system was the engine that drove the English state. The export tax on wool, known as the maltolk, was enormous, often constituting over a third of the crown's total annual revenue. This was not petty cash, this was the money that built armies. The 100 Years' War against France, that long, epic struggle, was largely financed by English wool. King Edward III went so far as to use the future revenue from the wool tax as collateral for massive loans from Italian banking families, effectively mortgaging the nation's sheep to fund his military ambitions. The system was so lucrative that it spawned its own powerful institution, the Merchants of the Staple. This was an exclusive company of traders licensed to handle the wool trade, and they grew immensely wealthy and powerful, operating like a state-sanctioned monopoly. Their headquarters in the continental staple, particularly in Calais after it was captured from the French, became a fortified English stronghold, complete with its own treasury and garrison, paid for by the wool trade it existed to protect. For the actual English wool producers, the abbots with vast flocks and the rural gentry, the staple system was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it guaranteed a stable, organized market for their product. On the other, it meant they received lower prices than they might have in a free market, as the crown and the staple merchants took their hefty cuts. This led to frequent tensions and even rebellions as Parliament, filled with these very landowners, often tried to resist the king's demands for higher wool taxes. They understood that their wealth was being directly harvested to fund the crown's wars, yet even they could not deny the broader strategic advantage. By controlling the supply of such a vital raw material, England held the Flemish and Italian textile industries hostage. The magnificent cloth of Bruges and the fine fabrics of Florence literally could not exist without English wool. This dependency gave England a form of soft power that was rare in the medieval world, the power to impose an economic sanction that could cripple entire regions abroad. The humble sheep grazing on English hillsides had become an unwitting soldier in a war of economic dominance, proving that true power lies not always in controlling territory, but in controlling the resources that others desperately need. But while the English crown centralized its wool trade to project power from home, the Hanseatic League perfected a far more daring strategy, planting permanent, sovereign fragments of itself directly inside the territories of its most important trading partners. These were the Steelyards, and they were far more than just warehouses or merchant quarters. Imagine a walled compound on the banks of the Thames in London or the Volkhov in Novgorod, flying the League's flag, operating under its own legal code and governed by its own officials. This was not a simple embassy requesting favors. It was a semi-independent commercial fortress, a beachhead of economic power that allowed the Hansa to operate with impunity deep within rival kingdoms, turning foreign soil into a home field advantage. The legal status of these enclaves was their most powerful feature. Through hard-nosed negotiation and the sheer indispensability of their trade, the League secured extraordinary privileges called Fortified. Within the walls of the London Steelyard, Hanseatic merchants were subject to their own laws and judged by their own aldermen, effectively creating a legal bubble where the local king's authority was suspended. They were exempt from many local taxes and tariffs, could store their goods securely, and even maintain their own armed guards. This extraterritoriality was a monumental advantage. It meant that disputes between Hanse merchants were settled quickly by their own courts under their own commercial laws, avoiding the expensive and biased justice of local rulers. It provided a safe, predictable environment for business that was utterly unique in the volatile world of medieval trade, making the Steelyard the most secure and efficient place for any English or Russian merchant to do business with the North. Functionally, the Steelyard was a multi-tool of influence. By day, it was a bustling economic hub where the wealth of the Baltic was unpacked and traded. The London compound received shiploads of timber, wax, furs, and rye from the east, exchanging them for England's prized raw wool and later, its fine cloth. The Novgorod branch, known as Peterhof, was the League's gateway to the vast Russian hinterland, a source of luxury furs like sable and squirrel that were worth a fortune in Western markets. But by night, the Steelyard's gates closed, and it transformed into a diplomatic fortress and an intelligence center. The senior merchants, often some of the League's most skilled negotiators, would host dinners for local nobles and crown officials, gently lobbying for policies favorable to the Hansa and gathering crucial information on political shifts, market demands, and potential rivals. They were the eyes, ears, and voice of a commercial empire, operating with a level of access and protection that no foreign merchant guild could ever hope to match. Perhaps most strikingly, these enclaves served as unsinkable aircraft carriers for Hanseatic naval power. The Steelyards were built like fortifications for a reason. Their warehouses were sturdy enough to be converted into barracks, and their wharves could service and supply the League's warships. In times of conflict, like the Hanseatic War against Denmark, the London Steelyard became a vital forward base where the League's fleet could resupply and repair without relying on, or even informing, the English king. This allowed the Hansa to project military force across the North Sea with a logistical ease that rivaled many sovereign nations. The compound in Bruges even maintained its own crane and shipyard, a clear statement that this was not just a trading post but a fully operational naval station on foreign soil. The ultimate power of the Steelyard, however, was psychological. For the local population, these walled compounds were a constant physical reminder of where real economic power lay. The sight of Hanseatic merchants living under their own laws, flaunting their wealth, and enjoying privileges denied to local traders bred resentment, but also a grudging dependency. The King of England might wear the crown, but he knew that disrupting the Steelyard meant disrupting the flow of the naval supplies needed for his ships, the wax for his churches, and the silver that financed his court. The Steelyard was the ultimate manifestation of the Hanseatic League's unique power. It commanded not through conquest, but through sheer commercial necessity. It proved that an empire could be built with ledgers and privileges rather than swords and titles, establishing a template for the corporate sovereignty that would define global trade for centuries to come. Yet for all the economic and political power wielded from fixed points like the Hanseatic Steelyards, the most daunting challenge of medieval power projection was supporting a massive military force thousands of miles from its home base. This was the monumental task faced by the Crusader states, fragile European outposts clinging to the coast of the Levant. Their survival depended entirely on a web of supply lines so long, so complex, and so vulnerable that they became a strategic frontier in themselves. The real battle for the Holy Land wasn't just fought on the walls of Jerusalem or the fields of Hattin. It was won and lost on the shipping lanes of the Mediterranean and the dusty caravan routes of Anatolia. Mastery of logistics, the unglamorous art of moving food, weapons, and reinforcements, was the true secret to sustaining a crusade, offering a stark lesson in the limits of ambition without a reliable pipeline of power. The lifeline of the Crusader states ran across the sea, and it was controlled not by kings but by merchants. The great maritime republics of Italy, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa possessed the ships and the navigational skill to make the perilous months-long journey from Europe to the ports of Acre and Jaffa. They became the indispensable logistics partners for every crusading army, but their service always came at a price. A king like Richard the Lionheart of England didn't just hire their ships, he mortgaged his entire campaign to them. The Italian navies demanded not only payment in gold but also extraordinary concessions, exclusive trading rights in captured cities, their own autonomous neighborhoods within those cities, and exemption from taxes. When the Crusaders captured Acre in 1191, the Genoese and Venetians were rewarded with entire urban quarters that functioned much like Hanseatic steelyards, becoming states within a state. This created a paradoxical situation where the very powers propping up the Crusader presence were also carving it up for their own commercial benefit, making the Italian city-states the ultimate war profiteers of the medieval world. Once the men and material arrived in the Levant, a second, equally dangerous logistical challenge began, moving them inland. The journey from the coast to Jerusalem or other strategic inland points meant traversing harsh, arid terrain that was perfect for ambush. Muslim forces, under commanders like the brilliant Saladin, became masters of harassing these supply caravans, using their faster, lighter cavalry to strike at the vulnerable lines of marching men and slow-moving ox carts. A Crusader army could be starved into submission without ever fighting a major battle. To counter this, the Crusaders built a network of some of the most formidable castles ever constructed, like the famous Crac des Chevaliers. But these were not just defensive strongholds, they were logistical way stations. Positioned a day's march apart, they allowed a Crusader force to move from one secure base to another, sheltering from attack and drawing on pre-positioned stores of food, water, and weaponry. Control of these castles meant control of the supply routes, and losing one could sever a vital artery, dooming the settlements that depended on it. Perhaps the most sophisticated and overlooked aspect of Crusader logistics was their reliance on local alliances. The European invaders were not operating in a vacuum. They entered a complex Middle Eastern political landscape ripe with opportunity. They quickly learned that their survival depended on deals with local Christian communities like Armenians and Maronites, who provided guides, intelligence, and access to local food sources. More surprisingly, the Crusaders often made pragmatic truces with their Muslim neighbors, even as they fought Saladin's larger armies. A local emir might grant safe passage to a Crusader caravan in exchange for a share of the tolls or a temporary alliance against a rival Muslim ruler. These deals were a necessary betrayal of the Crusades' ideological purity, but they were a testament to the grim reality of logistics. An army that cannot eat cannot fight. The ability to navigate this intricate web of local politics was often as important as military prowess. In the end, the history of the Crusader supply lines is a story of overextension. For brief periods when the sea lanes were secure, Italian support was steady, and a string of castles controlled the interior. The Crusader states thrived. But this equilibrium was always fragile. A shift in the political winds in Genoa could divert a vital fleet. A successful Muslim siege against a single key castle could cut a kingdom in half. A drought could devastate local food supplies, making the colonies entirely dependent on shipments from Sicily or Cyprus that might not arrive. The eventual collapse of the Crusader states was not simply a military defeat. It was a logistical failure. It demonstrated the ultimate limit of medieval power projection. You could only control territory as far as your supply lines could reliably reach. The Crusades stand as history's most dramatic example that a grand vision is worthless without a practical plan to feed it, proving that the most important maps for any general are not the maps of battlefields, but the maps of supply routes. Yet while the Crusaders struggled to maintain tenuous supply lines across vast oceans, an entirely different model of long-distance connectivity was flourishing much closer to home, and it required no castles, no Italian fleets, and no king's ransom. For centuries before European ships ever appeared on the horizon, the great river systems of North America served as natural highways for a complex web of indigenous trade and political influence. The Mississippi River, with its countless tributaries, was the epicenter of this activity, a flowing continent of possibility that enabled the rise of some of the most sophisticated societies north of Mexico. To see these rivers merely as geographical features is to miss their true role. They were the dynamic, pulsing arteries of a vast, interconnected world, where power was measured not in fortified walls, but in the reach of one's trade connections and the flow of prestige goods across unimaginable distances. At the heart of this system was a technological marvel of its own, the dugout canoe. Crafted from massive logs, often cypress or cottonwood, these vessels were far from primitive. They could reach lengths of over 50 feet and carry several tons of cargo along with a crew of paddlers. This was the semi-truck of the pre-Columbian world, a vehicle that transformed the river from a barrier into a superhighway. A journey that might take weeks overland through dense forests and across rugged hills could be accomplished in a matter of days on the current of the mighty Mississippi. This efficiency of movement meant that ideas, rituals, and material goods could travel thousands of miles, creating a shared cultural sphere that archaeologists call the Mississippian Interaction Sphere. A seashell carved into a ceremonial cup in the Gulf of Mexico could find its way to a temple in the upper Midwest, while copper nuggets hammered into ornate plates near the Great Lakes could be traded for southern flint in the bluffs of what is now Alabama. The city of Cahokia, sitting directly across the Mississippi from modern-day St. Louis, stands as the ultimate testament to the power this riverine network could generate. At its peak around 1050 AD, it was home to over 15,000 people, larger than any city in Europe at that time except for a few capitals. Its famous Monk's Mound remains the largest earthen pyramid in the Americas, but Cahokia's grandeur was not built on conquest in the traditional sense, it was built on connection. It was perfectly positioned to become the nexus of the American bottom, a fertile floodplain where trade routes from north, south, east, and west converged. The city became a grand exchange, part bustling port, part religious pilgrimage site, and part political capital. Chiefs here likely derived their authority from their ability to control, facilitate, and profit from this constant flow of people and goods. They could redistribute exotic items like whelk shells from the Atlantic, copper from Lake Superior, and mica from the Appalachians to loyal subordinates, cementing alliances and displaying their far-reaching connections. The goods moving along these waterways were more than just commodities. They were embodiments of power and belief. Materials like copper and certain rare types of stone and shell were not used for everyday tools. They were painstakingly worked into ritual objects, elaborate headdresses, ceremonial axes, and engraved cups that served as symbols of spiritual and political authority. The control over the acquisition and distribution of these prestige goods was a central function of the emerging chiefdoms. A leader who could provide his followers with such powerful items, sourced from the mystical, faraway places where they originated, was demonstrating a connection to the supernatural world and the distant realms of the earth. This system created a form of soft power that bound widely scattered communities together through shared religious practice and a common hierarchy of value, all facilitated by the constant movement of canoes on the rivers. This vast network also functioned as an early information highway, spreading cultural and technological innovations at a remarkable pace. the idea of building large, flat-topped earthen mounds for temples and elite residences, a hallmark of Mississippian culture, spread up and down the river systems. So too did artistic styles, religious symbols, and possibly even games like chunky, which involved rolling a stone disc and throwing spears to mark where it would stop. This cultural exchange suggests a level of interaction and mutual influence that challenges the old stereotype of isolated, static Native American tribes before European contact. They were, in fact, part of a dynamic and interconnected continent, with the Mississippi River and its tributaries serving as the central nervous system. The waterways did not just carry goods, they carried a shared identity, weaving together hundreds of independent communities into a vast, intricate tapestry of trade, ritual, and power that shaped the continent for centuries, all without a single written decree or standing army. While the riverine networks of North America connected cultures through trade and shared ideas, high in the Andes Mountains, a different kind of power was being cemented with stone and sheer ambition. The Inca Empire, rising to its zenith in the 15th century, engineered the most spectacular and demanding road system the ancient world had ever seen, the Quhapac-Ñan, or Royal Road. Stretching over 25,000 miles from modern-day Colombia down to Chile, this was not a single path but a complex web of highways that traversed some of the most extreme geography on Earth, from coastal deserts to jagged peaks over 20,000 feet high. For the Inca, this network was the literal backbone of their empire, a physical manifestation of their central authority that turned the formidable Andes from a collection of isolated valleys into a single, unified, and tightly controlled state. The engineering prowess behind the Quhapac-Ñan is still staggering to behold. This was not a system of dirt tracks. These were carefully constructed roads, often paved with stone, featuring stairways cut into cliff faces, drainage systems to handle torrential rain, and suspension bridges woven from grass fibers that swung perilously over roaring mountain rivers. The Incas built for permanence and efficiency, knowing that the stability of their realm depended on the reliability of these connections. The roads were strategically designed with two often parallel main routes, one along the high mountains and another along the coast, with countless lateral roads connecting them like rungs on a ladder. This allowed for movement and communication between every ecological zone in the empire, from the fish-rich ocean to the potato-growing highlands to the coca leaf-producing jungles. A message or an army could be sent to any corner of the realm with a speed and certainty that was unimaginable before its construction. The true genius of the system, however, lay not in the stonework, but in the human infrastructure that animated it. Stationed a day's run apart along the entire network were tambos, way stations that provided food, shelter, and supplies for authorized travelers. But the most famous component was the chasqui, the legendary relay runners. These were not mere messengers, they were a highly trained, elite corps. A chasqui would wait at his post, and upon seeing a fellow runner approaching in the distance, would set off at a sprint to meet him, taking the oral message or knotted string quipu record at a full run without breaking stride. Operating in the thin air of the high Andes, these runners could relay a message from Quito to Cuzco, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in an astonishing 5 to 10 days. This gave the Sopa Inca in his capital a near real-time understanding of events across his empire, allowing him to quash rebellions, manage resources, and project his will with an efficiency that rivaled the Roman Empire at its height. Ultimately, the Quhapac-Ñan was the Incas' most powerful tool for assimilation. The empire was not built by conquering a homogeneous people. It absorbed over 100 different ethnic groups, each with its own language, gods, and customs. The road was the primary instrument for weaving these disparate cultures into the imperial fabric. Along the roads, the Incas built administrative centers, storehouses for redistributed goods, and temples to the sun god Intai. The constant movement of soldiers, administrators, and mitre laborers fulfilling their rotational labor tax meant that Inca culture, law, and language were constantly on display and enforced. Conquered peoples were often forced to use the roads to send their most valuable objects and their children to the capital, Cuzco, a practice that simultaneously stripped them of wealth and indoctrinated the next generation into Inca ways. The road physically and symbolically linked every subject directly to the Sapa Inca, making resistance not just a political act, but a logistical impossibility. It was a breathtakingly effective demonstration that the most enduring conquests are not achieved by the sword alone, but by the road that carries its power. Yet while the Incas mastered their mountain realm with stone-paved roads and relay runners, an even more audacious feat of transportation was unfolding in one of the world's most hostile environments, the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the Sahara Desert. Here, where the very idea of a road seems laughable against shifting dunes and searing emptiness, medieval traders engineered a network of routes so vital they became the lifelines of empires. The Trans-Saharan camel caravans did more than just cross a desert. They performed the miraculous, stitching together the disparate worlds of West Africa and the Mediterranean, turning a barrier of sand into a bridge of gold, salt, and ideas that would reshape the global economy. The undisputed hero of this system was a creature perfectly evolved for the task, the camel. Its ability to travel for days without water, carry loads of up to 500 pounds, and navigate by instinct through featureless dunes made it the only vehicle capable of conquering the Sahara. But the real innovation was not the animal itself, but the scale and organization of the caravans. These were not small bands of traders, they were massive, mobile corporations. A major caravan could comprise thousands of camels and hundreds of people, merchants, guides, guards, and servants, moving in a disciplined line that could stretch for miles across the horizon. The logistics were mind-boggling. Organizers had to plan for months, securing supplies of dates and grain at oases, hiring experienced Tuareg guides who could read the stars and the sand, and coordinating a schedule that aligned with the seasons to avoid the killing heat of summer. This was a high-risk, high-reward enterprise where a single missed oasis or a sandstorm could mean death and the loss of a fortune. The empires that rose to control this flow of wealth became legendary. Ghana and later Mali did not necessarily mine all the gold themselves. Their power came from controlling the termini of the trade. They commanded the southern Sahel, the fertile borderlands between the desert and the forest where the gold fields were. By controlling the key market towns like Ouargla and later Timbuktu, these empires could tax every ounce of gold, every block of salt, and every bolt of cloth that passed through. The ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, became the wealthiest person in history not because he had a mountain of gold, but because he sat atop the pipeline that supplied gold to the entire known world. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he gave away so much gold that he caused inflation in the economies of Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula for a decade, was a breathtaking display of this power. It was a statement to the Islamic world and Europe that a new, unimaginably rich power had arrived on the world stage, and its wealth arrived on the backs of camels. The caravans carried more than just commodities. They were conduits for culture, religion, and knowledge. As the trade flourished, cities like Timbuktu transformed from simple trading posts into radiant centers of Islamic scholarship and learning. The wealth generated from the caravan trade funded magnificent mosques and vast libraries that attracted poets, astronomers, mathematicians, and jurists from across the Muslim world. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu became one of the intellectual capitals of the age, a place where scholarly debates influenced thought from North Africa to the Middle East. This cultural exchange flowed in both directions. Islamic architectural styles, legal concepts, and writing systems traveled south with the northbound caravans, deeply influencing the courts of West African kings. In return, stories of the sophistication and wealth of these African empires traveled north, captivating the Mediterranean world and placing West Africa firmly on its mental map. The camel caravan, therefore, was not just a mover of goods but a mobile university and a diplomatic mission, facilitating a dialogue between continents that elevated the status of all involved. Control over the oases was the ultimate key to this entire system. These isolated pockets of water and palm trees were the strategic choke points of the desert, every bit as critical as any Alpine pass or river toll station. The power to grant or deny access to an oasis was the power of life and death over a caravan, and by extension, over the empires that depended on them. Groups like the Tuareg, who controlled these vital way stations, wielded influence far disproportionate to their numbers. They could charge exorbitant fees for water and protection, or they could form alliances with the great empires, serving as their guardians of the desert in exchange for privileges and a share of the trade taxes. The rise and fall of Saharan empires often hinged on their ability to secure these alliances and maintain control over these tiny, verdant islands in a sea of sand. The story of the Trans-Saharan trade is ultimately a story of environmental mastery, proving that human ambition, when coupled with the right technology and organization, can transform the most formidable landscapes into highways of power and culture. While the camel caravans mastered the desert and the Incas the mountains, the survival of one of history's most enduring empires hinged on its mastery of the sea itself. For the Byzantine Empire, the glittering capital of Constantinople was more than a city. It was the world's greatest choke point, sitting astride the Bosporus Strait, the vital artery connecting the Aegean and Black Seas. But controlling this gateway was meaningless without the power to control the seas that fed it. This was the sacred duty of the dromon, the sleek, fast, and deadly galley that served as the empire's first and last line of defense. More than just warships, these vessels were the mobile enforcers of Byzantine authority, the guardians of its economic lifeblood, and the floating diplomats that maintained an empire when its land borders were constantly under siege. The dromon itself was a masterpiece of medieval naval engineering, evolved from the Roman Liburnian but perfected for a new era of warfare. It was a galley powered primarily by two banks of oars, typically 50 to 100 oarsmen, which gave it incredible burst speed and maneuverability independent of the wind. This was crucial for its primary mission, hunting down pirates, in the confined waters of the Aegean, dotted with countless islands that provided perfect cover for bandits. A sailing ship was at a mercy. A dromon, however, could launch from a concealed cove, row directly into the wind to intercept a target, and use its speed to ram or board before the prey could escape. But its most fearsome weapon was not its ram but Greek fire. This legendary incendiary substance, a state secret guarded as closely as any crown jewel, could be pumped through tubes mounted on the ship's prow, spraying a sticky, unquenchable fire onto enemy decks. The psychological impact of this weapon was as devastating as its physical effect. To a pirate crew, the sight of a dromon approaching, its fire siphons poised, was the stuff of nightmares. This relentless patrol of the sea lanes was the foundation of Byzantine prosperity. Constantinople was a consumption machine, a city of hundreds of thousands that needed a constant, massive influx of grain, silk, wine, and luxury goods. The Black Sea, often called the Roman Lake, was its breadbasket, shipping vast quantities of grain from the Crimean ports. The Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean routes brought in spices, papyrus, and oil from Egypt and the Levant. If these sea lanes were cut by piracy, the city would starve and the economy would collapse. The Drummond squadrons, therefore, were not a luxury. They were a public utility as vital as the aqueducts. By ensuring safe passage, they allowed the empire to collect lucrative customs duties at its ports, maintain affordable insurance rates for merchants, and guarantee that the markets of Constantinople remained the best stocked in the known world. This secure maritime environment was a powerful incentive for foreign merchants from Venice, Amalfi, and beyond to trade within the empire, bringing even more wealth and exotic goods into the Byzantine orbit. Beyond mere patrols, the dromons were versatile instruments of high statecraft. A squadron of these impressive warships arriving off the coast of a restive province or a wavering ally was a potent symbol of imperial resolve. They could project power without the need for a costly land invasion, reminding local governors of the long reach of the emperor in Constantinople. This naval diplomacy was also key to maintaining the complex web of alliances that kept the empire afloat. Byzantine diplomats often traveled on dromons, their safe passage and imposing arrival underscoring the seriousness of their mission. The empire could use its navy to provide escorts for allied vessels, blockade hostile ports like those of the Bulgarians or later the Arabs, or rapidly deploy a small, elite force of marines to a flashpoint anywhere on the coast. In an empire that was often losing territory on land, the sea remained a domain of absolute Byzantine dominance for centuries, and the dromon was the embodiment of that dominion. The ultimate testament to the dromon's success was not in the battles it won, but in the peace it kept. For long stretches of its history, the mere presence of these patrol galleys was enough to deter conflict and ensure compliance. They made the Mediterranean, or at least its eastern half, a Roman lake once more. This allowed the Byzantine economy to function as a truly integrated maritime system, where a merchant from Thessaloniki could plan a voyage to Trebizond with a reasonable expectation of safety. This predictability and security created a stable economic platform that sustained the empire through political crises, plagues, and constant military threats on its frontiers. The dromon's role was defensive and preservative, a constant, vigilant presence that turned the chaotic, dangerous sea into an ordered, predictable highway. In doing so, these ships did more than protect an empire. They preserved a civilization, ensuring that the light of Rome, however transformed, continued to burn in the east long after the west had fallen into darkness. Consider for a moment the humble bridge. Today, we cross them without a second thought, mere conveniences over water. But in the medieval world, a bridge was a spectacle of power, a statement of ambition permanently etched in stone and timber. To build one was to define nature itself, to chain a river that had once been a barrier, and the authority capable of such a feat, a king, a powerful bishop, a wealthy city, did not do it out of mere generosity. A bridge was an investment, and one that paid dividends in control, wealth, and military might from the very moment its foundation was laid. The most obvious power was economic, and it was collected one coin at a time. A strategic bridge became a compulsory toll booth, a choke point where all commerce was funneled into a single, easily monitored crossing. The famous London Bridge, with its 19 arches and bustling community of shops and houses built right on top of it, was a revenue-generating machine. Every cart of grain from Kent, every bale of wool from the Midlands, every trader entering the city had to pay for the privilege. This steady stream of income could fund everything from royal coffers to the bridge's own expensive upkeep. But the toll was more than just a tax. It was a tool of economic policy. A king could grant favored towns exemption from these tolls, giving their merchants a crucial advantage over rivals, or he could impose crippling fees on the goods of a political enemy, effectively strangling their trade without raising a sword. Beyond filling treasuries, bridges were instruments of immense military and strategic value. In times of peace, they facilitated the rapid movement of troops to quell local unrest, allowing a king to project his authority quickly across his realm. But in times of war, their value was incalculable. A castle guarded a location, but a bridge guarded a line of advance. The fortified bridge at Avignon, the Pont Saint-Bénézit, was a key strategic asset for the popes who resided there, controlling who and what could cross the Rhone River. Its towers and battlements were not for show. They housed garrisons that could seal off the crossing entirely. An army approaching a defended bridge faced a nightmare, a frantic assault across a narrow, exposed causeway under a hail of arrows and boiling oil. Conversely, destroying a bridge could save a kingdom, halting an invading force in its tracks and leaving them stranded on the wrong side of a swollen river. The ownership of a single crossing could dictate the outcome of a campaign and secure a border. Perhaps the most subtle yet profound power was the social and political prestige that a bridge conferred. The resources and organizational skill required to build and maintain a major bridge were far beyond the means of a local lord. Only the most powerful institutions, the crown, the church, or a wealthy commune, could undertake such a task. Therefore, a magnificent bridge was a permanent advertisement of that power. When a traveler crossed the monumental Pont d'Avignon, they were walking on the will of the Pope. When they paid their toll at London Bridge, they were contributing to the majesty of the English king. The bridge became a physical manifestation of the builder's benevolence, strength, and technological mastery, a daily reminder to every citizen and visitor of who held true authority in the region. It was a statement that the ruler could not only protect but also improve the lives of their subjects, binding communities together and literally building the infrastructure of a nation. In this way, the stone and mortar of a medieval bridge were woven with threads of commerce, coercion, and propaganda, making it one of the most potent and enduring symbols of control in the landscape. Imagine the frustration of a medieval king like Charlemagne, ruling an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. A rebellion breaks out in a distant province. By the time a messenger on a single, exhausted horse gallops into the capital with the news, weeks have passed. The rebellion has had time to solidify, gain allies, and perhaps even seize a crucial fortress. The king's response, no matter how powerful his army, will always be dangerously behind the curve. This was the fundamental problem of pre-modern governance. Distance defeated authority. But the most visionary rulers found a brilliantly simple solution, one that hacked the very physics of their time. They didn't try to make a single horse faster. They created a system where the message itself never stopped moving. They built the horse relay, a network of fresh mounts and dedicated riders that turned a kingdom's winding roads into an information superhighway, allowing a command from the center to echo instantly in the farthest corners of the realm. The mechanics of these systems were a masterpiece of logistical planning. The Persian Empire called it the Angarium, and the Romans had their cursus publicus, but the principle was universal. Along every major road leading from the capital, a series of relay stations were established at intervals of roughly 20 to 30 miles, the distance a horse could gallop at top speed before exhaustion. At each station, a dedicated courier would be waiting, along with a string of fresh, saddled horses. The incoming rider wouldn't even need to dismount. He would shout his message or hand over a sealed scroll to the fresh courier, who would immediately spring onto a new horse and continue the journey at the same breakneck pace. This meant the message could travel 24 hours a day, through darkness and bad weather, at a speed that was simply impossible for any single rider and mount. It was a perpetual motion machine for information, compressing weeks of travel into a matter of days and giving rulers a previously unimaginable ability to react in real time. This speed translated directly into coercive power. The most immediate application was military. A baron on the frontier contemplating rebellion would have to think twice, knowing that a report of his disloyalty could reach the king's ears within days, and a force of royal knights could be dispatched and arrive at his gates before he had even finished stocking his castle's granary. The relay system acted as a powerful psychological deterrent, making the central authority feel ominously close and all-seeing. It was also the ultimate tool for tax collection. Provincial governors knew that any attempt to skim from the royal treasury or delay shipments could be reported by a royal inspector and investigated almost immediately. The constant threat of sudden, unexpected audits from the capital kept local officials in a state of obedient efficiency, ensuring the steady flow of revenue that funded the entire state apparatus. Beyond enforcing commands and collecting taxes, these networks functioned as the central nervous system of an empire, providing a constant stream of vital intelligence. Couriers carried more than just royal decrees. They brought news of crop failures, rumors of foreign troop movements, reports on the mood of the populace, and updates on market prices. A Persian Shah in Persepolis or a Carolingian emperor in Aachen could thus breakfast on detailed reports from a dozen different provinces, giving him a panoramic, almost godlike view of his entire domain. This intelligence allowed for proactive governance, diverting grain to a region facing famine, preemptively reinforcing a border threatened by invasion, or manipulating trade policies based on accurate economic data. The ruler who possessed the fastest information flow held every strategic advantage, able to anticipate crises and seize opportunities while his rivals were still waiting for the news to arrive. The true genius of the horse relay, however, lay in its psychological impact. For the average subject living in a remote village, the sight of the royal courier was a potent symbol of the crown's reach. A blur of dust and pounding hooves, the rider's face set with determination, his tunic perhaps bearing the insignia of the king. This was a physical manifestation of a power that connected their isolated world to the throne itself. It made the abstract concept of the state tangible and immediate. The system proved that the essence of control in a vast territory is not merely the ability to command, but the capacity to know and to be heard without delay. In an age before the telegraph, the radio, or the internet, the rhythmic beat of galloping hooves on a post road was the sound of empire itself, a relentless pulse ensuring that the will of one man could be felt across a continent. While kings and emperors built vast networks of roads and relied on fleets of galleys, a quieter revolution in mobility was taking shape in the waterlogged landscapes of the Low Countries. Here, in the fertile but vulnerable delta of the Rhine, Scheldt, and Meuse rivers, the people of medieval Flanders and Holland faced a constant, existential threat from the sea itself. Their response was one of the most ambitious feats of environmental engineering in the medieval world, the creation of a sprawling, man-made web of canals. But these waterways were far more than just ditches for drainage. They became the very foundation of a unique form of power, transforming a soggy backwater into the economic engine of Northern Europe and forging a new kind of society where merchants, not mounted knights, held the ultimate authority. The primary battle was for survival. Much of this land lay below sea level, a fact that demanded constant vigilance and collective effort. The first canals were dug out of sheer necessity to drain peat bogs for agriculture and to prevent catastrophic flooding. This was a community-wide endeavor that required a level of organization and cooperation unseen in more traditional feudal societies. Instead of a top-down hierarchy of lords and serfs, the Dutch and Flemish developed water boards known as waterschappen or heemradschappen. These were among the world's first democratic institutions where local landowners, big and small, had a voice in managing the shared resource of water. This necessity bred a unique civic spirit and a pragmatic form of self-governance that would come to define the region's character. The constant struggle against the water forged a society that was practical, innovative, and fiercely independent, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in the balance of power. Once the land was secure, these canals swiftly evolved into the region's economic lifelines. In an area where overland travel was often slow and treacherous through the mud, the canals provided a smooth, reliable, and incredibly efficient means of moving goods. A single horse walking a towpath could pull a barge carrying dozens of times the weight it could manage on a cart. This logistical miracle turned cities like Bruges, Ghent, and later Amsterdam into international commercial hubs. Raw wool from England would arrive by sea and then be distributed via canal to countless weaving workshops in Flemish towns. The finished, high-quality cloth would then be gathered and sent back to the ports for export across the continent. The canals created a just-in-time delivery system centuries before the term was invented, enabling a level of industrial production and specialization that was unparalleled in medieval Europe. They weren't just waterways, they were the conveyor belts of the first great industrial zone north of the Alps. This economic prowess, flowing directly from control of the canals, translated into raw political power. The wealthy merchant guilds and cloth magnates who grew rich from this trade began to defy their traditional feudal overlords, the Counts of Flanders and the Dukes of Burgundy. The canals themselves became instruments of this defiance. A city like Ghent could control the water gates that regulated traffic into its heart, effectively deciding which goods entered and left. In times of dispute with their duke, the city could simply close these gates, imposing an economic blockade on the surrounding countryside that was loyal to the nobility. The canals also formed magnificent natural moats, making these merchant cities incredibly difficult to besiege. A feudal army, reliant on heavy cavalry, was virtually useless against a city accessible only by water and defended by determined citizens manning the walls. This defensive advantage gave the urban elites the confidence to demand and win extensive privileges and charters of self-government, freeing them from many feudal obligations and taxes. The ultimate symbol of this canal-forged power was the waterlinie, a deliberate defensive use of the landscape that would become a hallmark of Dutch military strategy for centuries. In times of invasion, the Dutch could open the sluices and flood the surrounding polders, creating a shallow, impassable sea that would halt enemy armies in their tracks while still being navigable by the flat-bottomed boats of the defenders. This was a form of defense that required no castles and few knights. It was wielded by engineers and sailors, and it perfectly encapsulated the new source of power in the Low Countries, control over water itself. The canals, therefore, did more than just make the region rich. They made it resilient and autonomous. They enabled the rise of a bourgeois, capitalist society where wealth derived from commerce and civic engineering trumped the old aristocratic ideals of land ownership and martial valor. In the flat, water-crossed lands of Flanders and Holland, the most powerful figure was not the lord in his stone castle, but the merchant in his guild hall, whose influence traveled effortlessly along the liquid highways he had helped to build. Yet while the merchants of the Low Countries were mastering their man-made canals, an entirely different kind of riverine mastery was unfolding far to the east, where Scandinavian adventurers turned the great natural waterways of Russia into their own personal highways of ambition. We often picture Vikings as raiders erupting from the sea to plunder monasteries and vanish again. But this is only half the story. A different breed of Norsemen, known as the Rus or Varangians, looked not west across the ocean, but east across the Baltic, seeing in the continent's mighty rivers not barriers, but pathways to empires of unimaginable wealth. Their longships, so terrifying on the open sea, proved equally revolutionary on inland waters, becoming the keys that unlocked a commercial corridor stretching from the frozen north to the glittering capital of Byzantium and the silver-filled markets of the Islamic caliphates. The sheer audacity of their river travel remains breathtaking. Their iconic longships with their shallow drafts and flexible hulls were perfect for this environment. A crew could sail across the Baltic, then rode deep into river systems like the Western Dvina or the Volkhov. When they inevitably encountered rapids or shallows, they simply hauled their remarkably lightweight vessels out of the water and portaged them, dragging them on logs overland to the next navigable river. This back-breaking process, repeated over and over, allowed them to stitch together a continuous route from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. The most famous of these was the Dnieper route, a watery staircase that descended through a series of terrifying rapids which the Norse named with ominous precision, like the Roaring One and the Insatiable, before finally opening into the wide, welcoming expanse that led to the Black Sea and Constantinople. This was not for the faint of heart. It was a testament to Norse endurance, ingenuity, and an unshakable hunger for trade, and what trade it was. From the cold, resource-rich north, the Varangians brought goods that were commonplace to them but priceless in the south. Thick furs of sable, fox, and beaver, prized for luxury clothing, amber, that fossilized gold of the Baltic, honey and beeswax, essential for lighting and preserving food, and tragically, slaves captured from warring Slavic tribes. In exchange, they returned north laden with the wealth of the sophisticated south, glittering Byzantine silver coins, which became the foundation of the early Norse economy, exquisite silks and brocades, fine wine and olive oil, and magnificent jewelry and weapons. The sheer volume of Islamic silver dirhams found in hoards across Sweden and Gotland is staggering proof of this trade's intensity. The rivers did not just carry goods, they funneled the very monetary lifeblood of the medieval world into Scandinavia, transforming local chieftains into international magnates. This economic activity quickly evolved into political power. The Varangians did not just pass through these lands, they settled and organized them. To protect their portage points and secure their trading posts, they built fortified settlements like the one at Staraya Ladoga and most famously at Kiev. These strongholds grew into powerful city-states that became the nuclei of the first Russian principalities. According to the ancient Russian chronicles, it was the Varangian chieftain Rurik who was invited to come and rule over the disorganized Slavic tribes, founding the Rurikid dynasty that would rule Russia for over 7 centuries. Whether entirely true or partly a foundation myth, this story underscores a fundamental reality. The Norse arrived as traders, but they stayed as rulers, using their control of the trade routes to establish a new political order. The ultimate expression of Varangian influence, however, was not in the forests of Russia, but in the dazzling court of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. So many Norsemen entered imperial service that the Byzantines formed them into an elite personal guard for the emperor himself, the legendary Varangian Guard. These tall, fearsome axemen, swearing loyalty only to the emperor, became his most trusted shock troops and bodyguards. They were the ultimate mercenaries, and their service created a powerful feedback loop. It gave the Norse unparalleled prestige, direct access to Byzantine gold, and intimate knowledge of imperial politics and military tactics. In return, it gave the emperor a force utterly loyal to his person, disconnected from the complex and treacherous factions of the Byzantine court. A young Norse warrior could start his journey on a remote Swedish river, travel the Dnieper trade route, and end up standing guard in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, his axe reflecting the light of 1,000 candles. He was a living symbol of how the Viking longship had shrunk the world, embedding Norse power, culture, and ambition deep into the political and economic fabric of Eurasia, forever altering the destiny of the continent. Yet for all the permanent power of steelyards and the engineered might of canals, some of the most influential trade in medieval Europe happened not in fixed locations, but on a schedule, blossoming and vanishing with the seasons. This was the world of the Great Fair Circuits, a brilliant and fluid system that turned the countryside of regions like Champagne into a temporary, pulsating heart of global commerce. For a few weeks each year, sleepy towns like Troyes, Provence, Bar-sur-Aube, and Lagny transformed into the medieval equivalents of massive international trade shows, drawing merchants from Flanders, Italy, Germany, and beyond. But these events were far more than just big markets. They were carefully orchestrated engines of economic diplomacy, where the routes to the fairgrounds became as strategically vital as the fairs themselves, and the guarantee of safe passage became a currency more valuable than gold. The sheer scale and organization of these fairs was unprecedented. They operated on a rotating annual cycle, ensuring that almost every month, one of the 4 key Champagne towns was hosting a major event. This created a perpetual motion machine for commerce. A merchant from Genoa could sell his cargo of eastern spices and silks at the Fair of Troyes, use the profits to buy high-quality Flemish cloth at the same event, and then travel to the next fair in the circuit to sell that cloth for even greater profit further north. This system eliminated the enormous risk and delay of making separate voyages to different regions. The fairs provided a one-stop shop for the entire European economy, complete with standardized weights and measures, enforced contracts, and special courts to swiftly resolve disputes between merchants of different nationalities. This predictability and security were the true products being sold, and they were worth their weight in gold. The Counts of Champagne, who hosted these spectacular events, understood that their power derived not from taxing the land, but from facilitating this flow. Their most powerful tool was the promise of safe conduct, known as the conduit des foires. This was a royal-level guarantee of protection for all merchants traveling to and from the fairs, regardless of their nationality or religion. Within the peace of the fair, all past debts and even ongoing feuds were temporarily suspended. A German merchant who would be a sworn enemy of an Italian on the open road was within the fairgrounds a protected business partner. This transformed the routes leading into Champagne into sacred corridors of commerce. Princes and lords along the way, who might otherwise have been tempted to rob passing merchants, were strong-armed or bribed into honoring the Count's safe conduct. Their cooperation was purchased with a share of the prosperity, as the influx of wealthy travelers meant business for everyone: the innkeepers, the stable hands, the food vendors. The Counts of Champagne effectively created the first medieval free trade zone, and the roads to get there became its protected arteries. Controlling this access granted the Counts a form of soft power that rivaled many kings. By threatening to withdraw safe conduct from the merchants of a particular city or region, a count could impose a devastating economic boycott without ever raising an army. This gave them incredible leverage in political disputes. They could also use the fair as a stage for high-level diplomacy. The concentration of so much wealth and influence in one place made it the perfect backdrop for treaty negotiations, royal marriages, and intelligence gathering. Bankers from Lombardy set up tables to exchange currency and arrange letters of credit, creating an early international financial system that operated across the fair circuit. The flow of goods was matched by a flow of information, gossip, and innovation, making these seasonal events the internet hubs of their day, where the latest trends in everything from fashion and finance to music and medicine were disseminated across the continent. The ultimate lesson of the Champagne fairs is that power can be transient yet profound. The counts never built a traditional empire of conquered lands. They built an empire of time and trust. Their domain existed for a few glorious weeks each year in a field outside Troyes, but the economic patterns it established reshaped Europe forever. The fair circuit demonstrated that the most effective control sometimes lies not in permanent domination, but in creating the conditions for others to thrive. By providing the stage, the security, and the rules, the Counts of Champagne became the indispensable directors of a play that everyone else wanted to be in. Their legacy was not carved in stone, but woven into the seasonal rhythms of commerce, a brilliant reminder that some of the most powerful maps are those that are drawn and redrawn with the turning of the seasons, gathering the world's wealth in a temporary embrace before sending it forth again, forever altered. But while the great fairs of Champagne created temporary hubs of commerce and the Varangians mastered riverine trade routes, a different kind of organization was weaving a more permanent and far more secretive web of power across Europe, one that combined the fervor of faith with the cold precision of finance. The Knights Templar began as a small band of warrior monks sworn to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, but they soon evolved into something far more revolutionary, the world's first multinational banking corporation. Their power did not stem from controlling a single trade route or commodity, but from mastering the most elusive and valuable thing of all, the movement of money itself. Through a network of fortified monasteries called preceptories, they built a financial infrastructure so advanced and so secure that it made them the trusted vault for everyone from a humble pilgrim to the King of France, granting them a form of influence that was both immense and utterly unique in the medieval world. The system was born from a practical need. A pilgrim embarking from London or Paris to the Holy Land faced a daunting and dangerous journey, and carrying a purse full of gold was an open invitation to bandits. The Templars offered a brilliant solution. A pilgrim could deposit his entire life savings at the Temple Church in London and receive a coded letter of credit. This piece of parchment was worthless to a thief, but upon presentation at any Templar preceptory along the route, or better yet, at the Temple Mount itself in Jerusalem, the pilgrim could withdraw the funds in the local currency. The order took a small fee for this service, but it was a price worth paying for safety. This innovation eliminated the staggering risk of carrying valuables across continents, and it made the Templars indispensable. Their preceptories, often built like fortresses, were the automated teller machines of the crusading age, but with crossbowmen standing guard. This service for pilgrims, however, was just the beginning. The Templars' real power emerged when they began providing the same service to Europe's most powerful rulers. Kings like Louis VII of France discovered that financing a crusade was a logistical nightmare involving the movement of vast sums of money across thousands of miles. The Templars solved this too. They could collect taxes and tithes from across a kingdom, safeguard the funds in their main treasury in Paris, and then disperse them on demand to royal agents in the Levant. This turned abstract wealth into readily available capital right where it was needed most, on the front lines. The Templars became the financial engine of the Crusades, but in doing so, they also became the bankers to the crowns of Europe, holding massive deposits for England, France, and the papacy. They weren't just moving money, they were becoming the central nervous system of European finance. the political leverage this afforded them was extraordinary. A king who was deeply in debt to the Templars, as many were, found his options severely limited. The order could, by calling in a loan or delaying a transfer, effectively dictate royal policy or influence decisions about war and peace. They served as trusted tax collectors, treasurers, and even advisors in royal courts, giving them an insider's view of every political intrigue and financial secret. This placed them in a position of immense, albeit often quiet, power. They were the keepers of the keys to the kingdom's vault, and everyone from the monarch down knew it. Their financial network made them a state within a state, answerable ultimately only to the Pope, and their influence reached into the highest echelons of power. Yet this very power, built on trust and secrecy, would eventually sow the seeds of their destruction. The same kings who relied on them for loans came to resent their independence and their wealth. Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the order, famously turned on them in 1307, arresting Templars across his kingdom on trumped-up charges of heresy and corruption in a brutal campaign to seize their assets and erase his debts. The Templars' sophisticated financial system, which had made them so powerful, also made them a target for a cash-strapped monarch who realized that the fastest way to fill his empty coffers was to destroy his bankers and take everything they had. Their tragic end is the ultimate cautionary tale of medieval power, that controlling the flow of capital could make you the most indispensable player in the world, but it could also make you the most vulnerable when that world turned against you. But just as the Templars mastered the flow of capital across Christendom, a new power was rising in the East that would seize control of the very source of that wealth. For centuries, the legendary Silk Road had been a sprawling, multi-headed network, with no single empire able to fully dominate its entire length, that changed with the meteoric rise of the Ottomans. As they expanded from a small Anatolian beylik into a continent-straddling empire, their strategic gaze fell upon the ancient trade routes that connected east and west. They realized that the true prize wasn't just territory, but the choke points where commerce naturally condensed. By systematically conquering these key nodes, they didn't just participate in the Silk Road trade, they weaponized it, turning the flow of luxuries into the financial fuel for their military machine and a powerful tool of geopolitical coercion. The linchpin of this strategy was, of course, their magnificent capital, Constantinople. After Mehmed II's conquest in 1453, the city was revitalized as Istanbul and strategically repositioned as the sole gateway between the continents. The Ottomans now controlled both sides of the Bosporus Strait, the vital bottleneck through which all maritime trade between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass. But their ambition reached far beyond this single checkpoint. They pushed eastward, capturing the crucial land routes as well. The conquest of the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517 gave them control over the vital ports of Alexandria and the Red Sea trade, while their dominance in Anatolia and the Caucasus allowed them to command the overland caravan trails from Persia and Central Asia. One by one, they turned the alternative paths of the Silk Road into dead ends, methodically funneling all commerce toward the customs houses and markets of Istanbul. This control allowed them to extract wealth on an unprecedented scale. Every camel, every bale of silk, every sack of spices that passed through Ottoman territory was subject to a complex system of tariffs, tolls, and state-sanctioned monopolies. The revenue was staggering. It funded the construction of the massive mosques that defined the Istanbul skyline, paid the salaries of the vast imperial bureaucracy, and most importantly, bankrolled the formidable Ottoman war machine. The legendary Janissary Corps, the powerful artillery units, and the extensive navy were all sustained by taxes on trade. the spices that flavored a Venetian noble's dinner and the silk that adorned a French king's court were, in effect, paying for the very armies that threatened those same European powers. The Ottomans had perfected a system where their enemies' appetite for luxury directly financed their own military expansion. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Ottoman control was its use as a diplomatic and strategic weapon. Understanding Europe's insatiable demand for Eastern goods, the sultans could reward allies and punish rivals by manipulating access. Granting favorable trading terms to the city-state of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, for instance, could enrich a useful ally and create a dependent buffer state on the Adriatic. Conversely, they could impose embargoes or exorbitant duties on merchants from hostile powers like Venice or the Habsburg Empire, making their goods prohibitively expensive and stirring discontent among European elites who were suddenly deprived of their luxuries. This economic pressure could be used to extract political concessions, secure favorable peace treaties, or simply weaken a rival's economy. The Silk Road was no longer a neutral channel of exchange. It was a lever, and the Sultan's hand was firmly on it. The ultimate testament to this strategy's success was the desperate European response, the age of exploration. Frustrated by the Ottoman monopoly and the steep prices it enforced, kingdoms like Portugal and Spain began searching for alternative routes to the sources of spice and silk, leading them to chart sea paths around Africa and accidentally to the Americas. This monumental shift in global history was, in many ways, a direct reaction to Ottoman control of the ancient land routes. The Ottomans, by mastering the Old World's geography of trade, inadvertently forced Europe to discover the New World. Their strategic management of the Silk Road didn't just fill their treasury, it altered the course of global exploration, trade, and empire, proving that the power to control a pathway can ultimately inspire the creation of entirely new ones. Imagine the sheer terror of a medieval merchant captain, his ship heavy with silks from the Levant or wool from England, watching the horizon for the one sight he dreaded most, the distant silhouette of a pirate galley. In an era where the sea was a lawless wilderness, a single voyage could mean the difference between fortune and ruin, or even life and death. This constant vulnerability gave rise to one of the most pragmatic and state-driven transport systems of the age, the sanctioned convoy. This was not a casual agreement among sailors. It was a formalized, often mandatory, collaboration between commerce and crown, a floating fortress of collective security that fundamentally changed the relationship between private trade and public power. The system was brilliantly simple in its organization. A powerful entity, a king, a city-state like Genoa, or a merchant guild would announce the departure of a convoy weeks or even months in advance. This allowed merchants to plan their schedules and gather at a designated port. On the appointed day, a forest of masts would crowd the harbor as dozens, sometimes hundreds, of ships assembled into a disciplined fleet. The lead vessel, often a dedicated warship provided by the organizing authority, would hoist flags signaling the order of sail and the agreed-upon course. This was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a maritime parade, a carefully choreographed migration where discipline meant survival. The strongest and fastest ships might be positioned on the flanks, while the slower, more vulnerable vessels were tucked into the center of the formation, creating a mobile wall of wood and canvas that was far more daunting for any pirate to attack than a lone sail on the open ocean. For the merchants, the benefits were obvious. Safety in numbers was the primary draw. A pirate captain, even with a well-armed vessel, would think twice before engaging an entire fleet. An attack on one ship would mean facing the collective retaliation of all the others. The convoy also provided a form of mutual insurance. If a ship foundered in a storm or sprang a leak, others in the group could come to its aid, saving both crew and cargo. But this security came at a significant cost. The organizing authority charged hefty fees for this service, a convoy tax essentially, to cover the expense of the naval escorts and the administrative overhead. Merchants also had to sacrifice their independence and speed. They could no longer choose their own departure dates or take faster, more direct routes based on weather and whim. They were bound to the pace of the slowest ship in the fleet, a frustrating but necessary trade-off for safe passage. For the ruling powers, however, the convoy system was a masterstroke of policy that turned a defensive measure into a powerful tool of control and revenue. By mandating that all valuable trade must travel in these official convoys, authorities could effectively regulate and monitor commerce like never before. The designated assembly port became a natural choke point where customs officials could efficiently inspect cargo, assess its value, and collect import and export duties that might otherwise be evaded by independent captains slipping into smaller, unsupervised harbors. The convoy manifest, the official list of ships and their goods, became a precise ledger of economic activity, allowing the state to gather invaluable intelligence on what was being traded, by whom, and in what quantities. This system also allowed states to project naval power and cultivate political influence without maintaining a vast, standing navy in peacetime. The warships that escorted the convoys were, in effect, paid for by the merchants they protected. Furthermore, the power to grant or deny a place in the convoy became a potent diplomatic weapon. A ruler could exclude merchants from a rival city or an unfriendly nation, effectively cutting them off from lucrative trade routes and crippling their economy. Conversely, they could offer convoy protection to an ally as a tangible sign of support. The convoy, therefore, was far more than just a defensive formation. It was a floating extension of state authority, a mechanism for economic data collection, and a flexible instrument of foreign policy, all funded by the very merchants it was designed to protect. Now consider a substance so ordinary today that we scarcely give it a second thought. Yet in the medieval world, it was as precious as gold and as strategically vital as any fortress: salt. This simple mineral was the silent engine of survival and the spark of conflict, and the pathways carved to move it, the legendary Alpine salt routes, became some of the most fiercely contested and politically charged maps of power in all of Europe. Unlike the glittering silks of the Orient or the rare spices that fueled empires, salt was a necessity for every single person, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest king. Its value did not come from rarity or exoticism, but from an undeniable, universal need. It was the only known way to preserve food through long winters, a crucial flavor enhancer for bland diets, and even a key ingredient in medicines and industrial processes like leather tanning. This universal demand meant that whoever controlled the salt controlled a fundamental lever of daily life and economic stability. The geography of salt created natural monopolies that ambitious states were quick to exploit. Salt had to come from somewhere, either evaporated from the sea or mined from the earth, and these sources were fixed points on the map. The city of Salzburg, whose name literally means salt castle, grew immensely powerful and wealthy from the ancient mines deep inside the mountain of Durenberg. From this subterranean treasure trove, a network of trails and later purpose-built roads fanned out, carrying the precious white gold north into Bavaria and Bohemia. The Archbishop of Salzburg, who controlled these mines, wielded power far beyond his ecclesiastical title. He was a salt baron, his authority and riches flowing directly from the mineral veins beneath his domain. He could dictate prices, grant exclusive trading rights to favored merchants, and use the revenue to build magnificent churches and fortifications that were monuments to his salt-funded power. But perhaps no power mastered the politics of salt more brilliantly than the Venetian Republic. Lacking any significant salt deposits of their own, the Venetians executed a breathtaking strategy of commercial manipulation. They used their naval might to conquer and control the salt pans of the Adriatic Sea at places like Servia and Chioggia. Then they issued a stunning decree. All merchants trading in Venice were required to purchase a set quantity of Venetian salt, often at inflated prices, before they could trade any other goods in the city's bustling markets. This forced consumption transformed salt from a simple commodity into a mandatory transaction fee, a clever tariff that generated a steady, enormous revenue stream. Furthermore, Venice would often buy up the entire harvest of rival salt producers, not to use it, but to create artificial scarcity and drive up prices across the continent. They turned salt into a financial instrument, using their control over its distribution to manipulate entire economies and fund their maritime empire. The physical routes that carried this vital mineral were themselves arteries of influence, every bit as strategic as any military road. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, that ran from the salt pans of Ostia to the Sabine Hills in central Italy, was one of the oldest and most important highways of the Roman Republic, and it remained a vital corridor for centuries. In the Alps, passes like the Brenner were used for salt as much as for spices or silks. Controlling a key bridge or a narrow mountain pass on these routes meant you could tax every single cartload that passed through. The income from these salt tolls was so reliable and lucrative that it became the primary funding for the maintenance of the roads themselves, as well as for the castles and garrisons built to protect them. A lord stationed in a lonely Alpine fort, collecting his fee from the salt merchants, was participating in an economic system that connected the diet of a German farmer to the political fortunes of an Italian doge. This struggle over the salt routes often erupted into open conflict in what became known as the Salt Wars. In the 15th century, the city of Lüneburg in northern Germany went to war with the Dukes of Brunswick-Lüneburg over the rights to its immensely profitable salt springs. In the Italian Alps, the Duchy of Milan and the Swiss Confederacy clashed repeatedly over control of the salt trade coming over the Gotthard Pass. These were not minor border skirmishes. They were serious conflicts fought over the right to tax and distribute a commodity that everyone needed. The outcome of these wars could determine the economic fate of a region for generations, deciding whether a town would prosper as a trading hub or wither into obscurity. The legacy of these routes is etched into the very landscape and language of Europe. Innumerable towns across the continent bear names like Salzwedel, Salzburgen, or Hallstatt, all containing the Germanic root for salt, Hall, marking them as ancient way stations or production centers on this vast network. The wealth generated built not just castles, but also hospitals, libraries, and charitable foundations, a testament to how a humble mineral could fund civilization itself. The story of the Alpine salt routes is a powerful reminder that the foundations of power are not always built on glamorous or exotic goods. Sometimes they are built on the most basic, universal necessities of life. Control what people need to survive, and you control the map upon which their lives are drawn. Yet for all the grand empires spanning networks of trade and communication, some of the most potent displays of medieval power were carved through the quiet, shadowy depths of a king's own forest. These were the royal hunting roads, private pathways reserved for the pleasure of the monarch and his court. To dismiss them as mere recreational trails is to miss their profound purpose. They were carefully engineered landscapes of power, where the thrill of the chase was intimately intertwined with the demonstration of absolute authority, blending the ruler's personal leisure with the cold, hard reality of his control over both land and people. The very act of creating these private roadways was a declaration of ownership on a staggering scale. Forests like Sherwood in England or Fontainebleau in France were not untamed wilderness. They were meticulously managed royal preserves, protected by some of the era's most severe and unforgiving laws. The forest laws, particularly those enacted by the Norman kings of England, were a brutal assertion of dominance. They designated vast swaths of the country as royal forest, land where the king had the sole right to hunt the valuable game within primarily the red deer and the wild boar. For the common people who lived in or near these forests, these laws were a source of immense hardship. It was illegal to hunt or even to disturb the game, to carry a weapon within the forest, or to clear land for farming. Poaching a deer was a capital offense, punishable by death or mutilation. These private hunting roads, therefore, were not just paths, they were the literal thoroughfares of privilege, cutting through a landscape where the king's deer had more rights than the king's subjects. Beyond their symbolic weight, these roads held immense strategic and military value. A well-maintained network of cleared paths winding through dense, otherwise impenetrable woodland was a hidden asset. In times of peace, they allowed the king and his retinue to move quickly and comfortably through the domain for the purpose of sport. But in times of rebellion or invasion, these same roads became secret military corridors. The king could discreetly move troops and supplies through what appeared to be a natural barrier, emerging unexpectedly to suppress a revolt or reinforce a garrison. The forest itself acted as a screen, hiding these movements from prying eyes. A local baron plotting treason might never suspect that a company of royal knights could be approaching his manor under the cover of the very woods he considered a hindrance. The hunting road, in this light, was a dual-purpose instrument, a playground for the powerful and a concealed highway for their enforcers. The hunt itself was a powerful piece of political theater, a ritual performed on these exclusive stages. It was far more than a sport. It was a microcosm of the king's court and his role as the ultimate provider and ruler. The elaborate ceremony of the hunt, with its specialized roles, its strict hierarchy, and its precise rituals reinforced the social order. The king was always the central figure, the one who would make the final killing blow. His nobles participated not as equals, but as members of his court, their proximity to him during the chase reflecting their status and favor. The entire event, from the gathering at dawn to the feast in the evening featuring the day's kill, was a performance of power and patronage. It was a way to bond with the aristocracy, to reward loyalty, and to display the physical prowess and martial skill that were still essential components of kingship. Ultimately, these private roads were a constant physical reminder of the boundary between the ruler and the ruled. For the commoner forbidden from even walking on them, their presence was a daily lesson in subservience. They could hear the distant sound of the hunting horn and the baying of hounds, an auditory marker of a world of privilege from which they were utterly excluded. This restriction of access was a classic tool of dominance, making the monarch's authority felt in the most personal way. The right to roam freely on one's own ancestral land was curtailed by the king's right to pursue his leisure. This created a landscape of power where every snapped twig under a peasant's foot could be construed as a crime, and every cleared path through the trees was a monument to the inequality that defined the feudal world. The royal hunting road, therefore, was the perfect fusion of function and symbol. It served the practical needs of sport and strategy, but its deepest purpose was to map the psychology of power onto the very earth, demonstrating that even in his recreation, a king was never truly at play, but always and forever enacting the rituals of control. From the snow-choked Alpine passes to the sun-scorched Saharan caravans, The story these 25 systems tell us is remarkably consistent and profoundly relevant. They were never just about the physical movement of goods or people. They were the living, breathing maps upon which the ambitions of empires were drawn, the instruments through which kings collected their taxes, merchants built their fortunes, and faiths spread their doctrines. Every toll collected at a river bend, every message sped along a relay of horses, every ship protected in a convoy was a transaction of power. These networks decided who thrived and who withered, which ideas spread and which faded into isolation, ultimately shaping the political and economic landscape of the medieval world and laying the groundwork for our own. This history holds up a mirror to our modern era of global supply chains, fiber optic cables, and satellite networks. We might think we've moved beyond the simple coercion of a mountain toll station, but the fundamental dynamics remain strikingly familiar. Today, the control of a critical undersea internet cable or a major shipping choke line like the Strait of Hormuz confers a form of power that any medieval lord would instantly recognize. The ability to slow, stop, or tax the flow of data, goods, or energy is the modern equivalent of holding the Alpine Pass. Our digital platforms are the new market squares and steelyards where new rules are written and new tolls are extracted from a different kind of traffic. The players and the technologies have changed, but the game is the same: the relentless pursuit of control over the pathways that connect our world. So the next time you see a container ship on the horizon, or receive a package delivered from across the globe in a matter of hours, remember the long legacy of the transport systems that made it possible. Think of the Hanseatic cog sailing the Baltic, the Mongol rider galloping across the steppe, and the Venetian galley cutting through the Mediterranean. Their world of ambition, strategy, and power is not a distant memory. It is the foundation of our own. If you've enjoyed this journey through the arteries of medieval power, be sure to let us know your thoughts. Which of these systems did you find most fascinating? And looking at our own time, what modern network, be it a satellite constellation, a social media platform, or a global shipping route, do you believe is mapping the power structures of the future? Share your perspective in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden forces that have shaped our history.